I sat there in my battered uniform, forgotten, in a wheelchair that carried more battles than bones. They laughed at me. They shoved me like I was nothing. They thought I was too broken to fight back. But they didn't know I never fought alone. 30 minutes later, they learned the hard way what loyalty really looks like when the Marines showed up.
The little diner on Main Street was busy with the hum of lunchtime chatter, the clink of cutlery, the hiss of a coffee pot. Seated near the window, in a battered wheelchair, was Marcus Reed, 79 years old, clothed in a faded Marine Corps jacket that had seen better decades. The stitching along the cuffs was frayed, the once proud insignias now dulled with age, but Marcus wore it with the same quiet pride he'd carried through the jungles of Vietnam. He sat alone, sipping black coffee slowly, the afternoon sun catching the silver of his hair. No one paid him much mind until the group of young men swaggered in. 3 of them, maybe in their 20s, loud and brash in ripped jeans and designer hoodies. They scanned the room, smirking when their eyes landed on Marcus. One of them, a blond kid with a baseball cap turned backward, elbowed his friend and nodded toward the old veteran. "Look at that," he snickered. "Guess Halloween came early. Should have left that costume in the attic, Grandpa." Laughter barked from the others. They edged closer, voices rising to make sure the entire diner could hear. Another chimed in mockingly, "Hey, old man, where's your oxygen tank? Shouldn't you be in a museum or something?" Marcus said nothing. His hands, weathered and veined, stayed calmly wrapped around his coffee cup. His eyes remained fixed on the window, watching the cars drift past like slow-moving clouds. But the final blow came when the tallest of the group leaned down, placed a mocking hand on the back of Marcus's wheelchair, and shoved it roughly an inch backward. "Oops," he laughed. "Didn't see you there, Wheels." The diner went silent, except for the nervous clatter of a dropped fork. And Marcus Reed, in his old uniform and worn dignity, endured it all not with anger, but with a silence that somehow made the cruelty echo even louder. For a long, breathless moment, the diner stood still. No one moved. No one spoke. The laughter of the young men still hung in the air like smoke, but it was fading now, dissolving into a heavy, uncomfortable silence that pressed down on everyone inside those 4 walls. The waitress behind the counter glanced away, suddenly absorbed in wiping an already spotless surface. 2 men at the corner booth buried their faces deeper into their coffee cups. An elderly couple near the window pretended not to notice, murmuring to each other about nothing at all. Even the cook, a broad-shouldered man who usually barked orders from the kitchen, stayed hidden behind the swinging door. They all saw, they all heard, and they all chose to do nothing. In the back of the room, a small girl no more than 6 or 7 clutched her mother's sleeve, staring wide-eyed at Marcus. Her lips trembled, her fingers tightening around the fabric. There was no malice in her gaze, only confusion and a raw, aching sadness far too old for someone so young. Marcus Reed shifted slightly in his chair, the pain flaring sharp along his spine. His hands, gnarled and calloused, gripped the armrests of the wheelchair. He gritted his teeth, feeling the blood already trickling from a cut on his palm where it had scraped the rough floor. The metallic taste of humiliation filled his mouth, thicker than the blood. He didn't look at the boys. He didn't look at the people who refused to meet his eyes. Instead, he focused on the task before him, the simple, stubborn act of reclaiming his dignity. Slowly, deliberately, he tightened his core, shifted his weight, and pushed against the floor. His arms trembled with effort, muscles weakened by age and injury screaming in protest. But Marcus didn't falter. He wrestled the wheelchair upright, ignoring the way his vision swam for a moment. His breathing came in shallow gasps, but his back remained straight. He adjusted the worn jacket over his shoulders, straightened the battered lapel bearing the faded eagle, globe, and anchor of the Marines. Still no one moved. Still no one spoke. The young men who had mocked him now lingered uncertainly by the counter, their bravado wilting under the oppressive stillness. Yet not one of them apologized. Not one of them stepped forward. Marcus placed his scarred hands calmly back on the armrests, lifted his chin, and stared out the diner window into the bright, indifferent afternoon. They wanted him to be broken. They wanted him to be small. but he would not give them the satisfaction. In a room full of cowards hiding behind polite silence, it was the old man in the frayed uniform who showed the only kind of strength that mattered. And though they didn't realize it yet, the ground beneath them had already begun to shift. Caleb Turner sat 2 booths away, half hidden behind a plate of cold fries and a half-drunk soda. 17 years old, lean and restless, he had been scrolling aimlessly through his phone when the first shove hit Marcus's wheelchair. He saw it all, the laughter, the mocking sneers, the indifference of the room, and the way the old man's hands trembled, not from weakness, but from the sheer force of holding himself together. Caleb felt his stomach twist in a way that had nothing to do with bad diner food. His father had always told him that real courage wasn't about swinging fists or shouting the loudest. It was about standing tall when it would be easier to stay small. Caleb had thought he understood that. But now, watching Marcus Reed struggle to right himself while grown men and women stared at their coffee cups, he realized how easy it was to forget. His fingers tightened around his phone. For a few long seconds, Caleb just sat there, paralyzed by the same fear that kept everyone else glued to their seats. Fear of getting involved, fear of standing out. But when he caught sight of the small girl clinging to her mother's sleeve, eyes wide with helpless sorrow, something inside him snapped. He unlocked his phone with trembling fingers and tapped the name he knew would answer, no matter what. The call picked up on the second ring. "Caleb." His father's voice crackled through the speaker, firm and steady as always. Caleb kept his voice low, glancing around to make sure none of the thugs noticed. "Dad, you need to come. Now. It's bad." There was a beat of silence, a silence heavy with meaning. "Where are you?" his father asked, already moving. Caleb could hear it in the background noise. "Murphy's Diner. Main Street," Caleb whispered. "There's this veteran. They're harassing him. No one's doing anything." Another pause. Then, short and sharp. "Stay put. Help's coming." The call ended without another word. Caleb slid the phone back into his pocket, heart hammering. He looked again at Marcus Reed, who now sat stiff-backed in his wheelchair, face turned toward the window, his bloodied hand resting calmly in his lap, like he hadn't just been humiliated in front of a roomful of cowards. Caleb wanted to move, to say something, but instinct told him to wait. Help was on the way. The kind of help that didn't arrive with sirens or flashing lights. The kind of help that marched on quiet boots and carried the weight of brotherhood forged in fire. Caleb wiped his sweaty palms on his jeans and waited, glancing at the clock above the counter. Minutes passed like hours. The young punks lounged by the jukebox now, laughing and nudging each other, still riding the high of their cruelty, completely unaware that the ground beneath them was about to shift. Caleb leaned back in his seat, breathing slowly, steadying himself. The old man in the wheelchair wasn't alone anymore, and in a few more minutes, the rest of the town would find out exactly what that meant. The clock on the diner wall ticked in slow, dragging seconds, each one loud in Caleb's ears. Marcus Reed remained where he was, silent, dignified, a monument that no one dared approach. The group of bullies continued to lounge near the jukebox, their laughter lower now, but still grating against the heavy air. Then came the sound, low at first, a distant rumble. The kind of sound that made glasses on tables tremble slightly. The kind that made hearts thud faster, without knowing why. Heads turned toward the windows just as a massive Humvee pulled to a heavy stop outside the diner, its tires grinding against the asphalt. The conversations died, mid-sentence. Forks clattered onto plates. The room seemed to hold its breath. The doors of the Humvee swung open with military precision. Out stepped 3 Marines in full dress uniform, the deep blue coats pressed to sharp edges, white covers glinting under the afternoon sun. The ribbons on their chests told stories most of the room wouldn't understand. Their boots struck the ground with the kind of finality that spoke of places darker and harder than anyone here had ever known. They didn't shout. They didn't flex or threaten. They simply moved with the gravity of men who had nothing to prove. The leader, a barrel-chested Marine with silver hair cropped tight to his scalp, pushed open the diner's door with the flat of his palm. The small bell overhead jingled a single, pathetic note, before being swallowed by the crushing silence inside. Every head turned, every breath caught. The bullies stiffened, unsure whether to laugh it off or run. Their bravado evaporated in the face of something they had never encountered before: real authority, real strength. Without a word, the Marines crossed the floor, boots thudding in unison. They moved not toward the jukebox, not toward the stunned customers, but toward Marcus Reed. Caleb watched, barely daring to breathe, as the lead Marine stopped directly in front of Marcus's wheelchair. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the Marine snapped into a perfect salute, sharp, clean, full of weight. The two men flanking him followed instantly. The diner was so silent, the ticking clock sounded like a drumbeat. Marcus, whose hands had gripped his lap tightly all this time, lifted one trembling arm. Slowly, deliberately, he returned the salute, his movements stiff, but the respect behind them shining undimmed. The Marine dropped his hand and spoke, voice clear and ringing in the stunned hush. "Sergeant Major Reed, sir, reporting in." Around the room, people lowered their eyes. The waitress wiped at a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. Even the toughest-looking men at the counter sat hunched, suddenly small in their chairs. The bullies who had shoved Marcus just moments ago shifted awkwardly, faces pale, shrinking back as if the floor itself might swallow them whole. Caleb sat frozen, a slow, fierce pride building in his chest. They had seen Marcus Reed as an old man in a broken body. Now, they saw him as he truly was: a warrior, a protector, a man who had once held the line when it would have been easier to fall. The leader of the Marines stepped closer, gently placing a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "You're not alone, sir," he said, quietly enough that only those nearest could hear. "You never were." Marcus didn't reply. He didn't need to. His presence, his endurance, and the silent weight of all he had carried for decades spoke louder than any words ever could. And for the first time in far too long, Marcus Reed sat taller in his chair, not because he demanded respect, but because he had reminded an entire town what it truly meant. The Marines stood firm, a wall of solemn honor in the middle of a diner that had, moments before, been filled with laughter and casual cruelty. The air hung heavy, thick with the unspoken weight of realization sinking into every soul present. The lead Marine, a man built like granite and carrying the scars of service in every line etched across his face, took one step closer to Marcus Reed. His boots landed softly but with a presence that seemed to shake the very floor. Without hesitation, he straightened his posture, squared his shoulders, and raised his hand in a crisp, flawless salute. "Sergeant Major Reed, sir," he said, his voice carrying through the silent room like a commandment. "Reporting in." Marcus's hands, still resting quietly on the arms of his wheelchair, trembled not from fear, but from the weight of memory and meaning. Slowly, carefully, he lifted one hand, his fingers curled slightly from the old injuries that never quite healed. His salute wasn't perfect. His arm wavered mid-air, but in that moment, it was the strongest, most powerful gesture anyone in the diner had ever seen. The Marine held his salute steady, unwavering, until Marcus's hand completed the motion. Then, as one, the two Marines flanking their leader brought their hands up too, their faces carved in stone, eyes locked respectfully on the man before them. No one in the diner moved. No one dared breathe. The group of young bullies who had so casually mocked the old man earlier now sat rooted to their seats, faces drained of color. Their smirks had vanished, replaced by the stunned, growing horror of boys realizing for the first time that the man they had laughed at bore the weight of sacrifices they could never begin to comprehend. One of them tried to look away, shifting uncomfortably, but the lead Marine caught the movement. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The silence itself was punishment enough. Near the counter, the waitress who had once turned her back wiped her eyes with a trembling hand. An old man in a flannel shirt, a Korean War veteran himself, pressed his cap against his chest. Even the cook, hidden behind the swinging kitchen doors, peeked out with wide, stricken eyes. Caleb sat frozen in his booth, pride swelling painfully in his chest. His father's words echoed in his mind. "You respect the ones who carried the weight before you ever knew it existed." The leader of the Marines lowered his salute with precision, stepped closer, and placed a hand lightly on Marcus's frail shoulder. "You didn't have to carry it alone, Sergeant Major," he said quietly, just for Marcus to hear. "You never did." Marcus didn't speak. He only nodded once, emotion filled with decades of grief, pride, and gratitude, all rolled into one. And in that silent exchange, something shifted permanently in the diner and in the town itself. The men who had once mocked lowered their eyes to the floor, unable to meet Marcus's gaze. Others who had said nothing, who had turned away, now stood awkwardly, ashamed of their own silence. Marcus Reed sat taller in his chair, not because anyone lifted him up, but because respect, true, hard-earned respect, had finally come to him, not through pity, not through apology, but through the undeniable power of honor rendered without fanfare. And for the first time in a long, long while, the old warrior didn't feel quite so alone. The silence lingered, heavy and raw, as the Marines lowered their salutes and stood beside Marcus like sentinels. For a few moments, it seemed the entire diner might hold its breath forever, frozen by shame and revelation. Then, one of the younger Marines, a dark-haired man barely older than Caleb, stepped forward. He cleared his throat, his voice steady but thick with emotion, and addressed the room. "You all need to know who you're sitting next to," he said, sweeping his gaze across the stunned faces. "That's Sergeant Major Marcus Reed." He paused, letting the name settle, watching the confusion flicker into faint recognition in some of the older patrons' eyes. "In 1968, at Kisan, when hell came raining down in the jungle, when most men would have run, Marcus Reed stayed. He dragged 12 wounded Marines out of the line of fire, carrying 2 at a time on his back when the medevacs couldn't reach them." A murmur rippled through the room, low and uneasy. He held the rear position at Hill 880, one alone for over 6 hours, defending a broken line so that others could live to see another dawn. He lost both his legs doing it, and still, he didn't quit until every last man was safe. The Marine's voice cracked slightly on the last word, but he recovered quickly, standing taller. "Silver Star, 2 Bronze Stars, 3 Purple Hearts," he added, his voice clear, proud. And he never once asked for anything in return. No one laughed now. The boys who had shoved Marcus shrank visibly in their seats, the bravado leaking out of them like air from a punctured tire. One of them dropped his gaze to the floor, cheeks burning red with shame. Another twisted a napkin into knots between trembling fingers. Around the diner, the effect was palpable. An old man, in a worn trucker cap, stood shakily to his feet, pressing a hand over his heart. A mother wiped tears from her cheeks, hugging her small daughter a little closer. The waitress who had looked away earlier now stood frozen behind the counter, her knuckles white where she gripped the edge. Near the windows, a Vietnam veteran with a silver beard saluted quietly, his shoulders stiff with old pride and old grief. Marcus Reed sat quietly through it all, his hands resting lightly on the arms of his wheelchair, his expression unreadable. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. He simply bore the weight of their stares and their silent apologies with the same steady dignity he had carried through jungle mud and artillery fire. The young Marine finished simply, "You disrespected a man whose name should be spoken with honor, a man who gave more than most of us can even imagine." And then he turned, placing a firm hand once again on Marcus's shoulder, a gesture of brotherhood, of loyalty that needed no further explanation. The message was clear. Marcus Reed wasn't just a forgotten old man in a wheelchair. He was a living monument. And at last, the people of American Hollow realized they hadn't been looking at weakness. They had been staring at strength they couldn't begin to comprehend, and had nearly missed it altogether. For a long moment after the young Marine's words faded into silence, the diner remained frozen in a kind of stunned reverence. No one seemed to know what to do, how to bridge the impossible chasm between who they had thought Marcus Reed was and who he had always been. Then, somewhere near the back of the room, a chair scraped against the floor. A man older, with weathered hands and tears shining stubbornly in his eyes, rose slowly to his feet. He clapped once, twice, Then again, stronger. The sound, sharp and startling against the stillness, seemed to shake the spell from the room. Another man joined him. Then a woman, pressing a napkin to her mouth to stifle her sobs. And then the sound grew, a tidal wave of applause crashing through the diner. Everyone stood. Every table emptied. Every heart, it seemed, cracked open in that instant, spilling out years of complacency, misunderstanding, and guilt. They didn't cheer. They didn't shout. They simply clapped, long and hard, for the man who had carried the weight of freedom on his back, quietly, for longer than any of them had realized. Caleb found himself standing too, hands stinging from how hard he clapped. Across the room, his father nodded once at him, the kind of nod a Marine gives when something has been done right. The bullies who had mocked Marcus sat trapped in their chairs, red-faced and shrinking smaller with every wave of applause. Some tried to join in, half-heartedly, but the looks they received from the Marines, from the customers, from the very fabric of the town pinned them in place, exposed and disgraced. It was too late for pretense. You could not buy respect when it had already been squandered. The diner's owner, a gruff man named Ed, wiped his hands on his apron and disappeared into the back for a moment. When he returned, he carried a small American flag, the cloth edges slightly frayed but still vibrant. Without ceremony, he approached Marcus's table and propped the flag up in the planter box beside the window, just over Marcus's shoulder. No words were exchanged. None were needed. Then Ed went to the back wall, took down an old beer advertisement, and replaced it with a freshly printed sign he must have had ready for a long time but never used until now. Reserved for veterans, always. The sign wasn't large, and it wasn't fancy, but it was permanent. A statement etched into the heart of the diner and into the town's memory. As the applause finally faded, the leader of the Marines leaned down beside Marcus and murmured, "Told you they'd remember." Marcus didn't answer with words. He simply lifted his head higher, his tired eyes glinting with something fierce and unbroken, and gave a small, solemn nod not just to the Marines, but to every soul who had finally seen him. Respect hadn't been given out of pity. It hadn't been demanded. It had been reclaimed, the way real respect always is, earned, endured, and impossible to forget. The afternoon sun spilled golden light across Main Street, casting long, warm shadows over the sidewalks and the weathered brick walls of the diner. Inside, the noise had faded to a quiet murmur, conversations soft, glances still lingering toward the man near the window. Marcus Reed remained where he had always been, seated in his battered wheelchair, his faded uniform jacket neatly adjusted over his shoulders. But something had shifted, something invisible yet profound. The world around him had finally remembered who he was. He sipped his coffee slowly, savoring the warmth, the simple act of being seen not as a burden, but as a part of something again. Outside the diner, a group of children chased each other across the sidewalk, their laughter sharp and bright in the crisp afternoon air. Caleb sat on the curb nearby, tossing a baseball with a smaller boy, perhaps a brother or a neighbor. They laughed, argued playfully, and plotted games with the easy confidence only youth carries. Marcus watched them with a small, quiet smile curving his lips. He wasn't smiling because of the applause earlier. He wasn't smiling because of the flag by his seat or the sign on the wall. He was smiling because, for the first time in a very long while, he saw proof that everything he had sacrificed, every wound, every lost friend, every heavy, silent burden he carried for decades, had not been forgotten, had not been in vain. Somewhere in those children's laughter, in the respectful nods from strangers, in the way people now held doors a little longer or straightened their backs when passing his table, Marcus found peace. Not because the town had finally realized his worth, but because he had always known it. He had never needed their validation to know who he was. But now, finally, he could lay down the silent weight he had carried for so long, if only for a little while. Across the street, the small American flag beside his table fluttered gently in the breeze, a quiet sentinel. A reminder. A promise. Marcus leaned back slightly in his chair, feeling the sun on his face, the laughter of the children washing over him like a song. His hands, gnarled and strong, rested peacefully on the worn arms of his wheelchair. And as the world bustled on around him, he let himself believe, even if just for a moment, that sometimes dignity endures longer than memory. Sometimes honor whispers louder than history books. And true courage, real, hard-earned, blood-stained courage, never really fades. It simply waits for the world to be ready to see it again.